The industry is currently fixated on the wrong scoreboard. Every quarter, the same hollow metrics dominate our conversations. We argue over which model topped the latest benchmark, who achieved the highest token throughput, or whose chatbot produced the most viral demo. The narrative is relentless. The AI war is being fought in laboratories, on leaderboards, and in the narrow space between competing models. This narrative is wrong. The actual war, the one that will determine who controls enterprise AI for the next decade, is not being fought in public. It is not happening on benchmarks or in consumer preference surveys. Instead, the battle is taking place in the infrastructure layer, within identity systems, data architectures, and the workflow engines that enterprises have already embedded into their daily operations. Most observers are watching the interface. Microsoft is building the control plane. Beneath the surface, a specific shift is occurring. Microsoft has positioned itself to own the 4 layers that actually matter in an enterprise environment. They are securing identity to dictate who can access what, and they are managing data to control where information lives and how it flows. They are scaling infrastructure to decide where processing happens, while simultaneously capturing workflow to govern how decisions are made and executed at scale. Competitors are building AI in isolation. Microsoft is building AI into the existing control plane where 400 million commercial seats already operate. That distinction matters more than any temporary model performance gap. The evidence is visible if you know how to read the architecture. Azure revenue grew 40% year over year, and the commercial cloud backlog jumped from $392 billion to $625 billion. This surge was driven primarily by OpenAI's contractual commitment to purchase $250 billion in incremental Azure services over time. Microsoft is also spending $80 billion on capital expenditure in 2025. With 2/3 of that allocated directly to GPU and AI infrastructure. These are not marketing investments. These are massive infrastructure bets. Meanwhile, consumer AI adoption metrics create an optical illusion of competition. ChatGPT reaches 200 million users, and Gemini integrates across Android and Search to touch billions of lives. Media coverage rewards novelty, so new model releases and viral demonstrations naturally dominate the headlines. But here is the structural truth. Consumer visibility does not predict enterprise dominance. Enterprise AI adoption moves at a glacial speed compared to the consumer market. Pilots take months to complete, and full deployments often take years to finalize. The economic value accumulates silently, far away from the headlines, inside the operational systems where companies actually run their businesses. Microsoft is winning where it matters. In the infrastructure layer, the compliance frameworks, the data architecture, and the organizational workflows where enterprises consolidate their operations. The market is measuring the wrong thing. It is measuring model performance and consumer preference when it should be measuring control. We should be asking who owns the identity layer, who controls the data, who provides the infrastructure, and who orchestrates the workflow. Microsoft owns all 4. This is not hype, and it is not a simple prediction. This is architectural inevitability playing out in real time. The victory is not coming. It is already embedded in the infrastructure decisions that enterprises made years ago. The question is not whether Microsoft will win the AI war. The question is whether the market will notice before the outcome becomes irreversible. The visibility trap. Before we can understand why Microsoft is winning, we need to understand why most observers think someone else is. The visibility trap is simple. Consumer AI creates an optical illusion of dominance that obscures the actual battle happening beneath it. ChatGPT's 200 million users appear to signal market leadership because the numbers are staggering. A product launched in November of 2022 reached 100 million users faster than any application in history, and it quickly dominated consumer consciousness. It became the primary reference point for what AI means to the general public. When people think of artificial intelligence, they think of ChatGPT. Google's Gemini integration across Android and Search reaches billions of devices, and that scale is almost incomprehensible. Android alone powers over 3 billion active devices globally. When you integrate AI into the operating system, the search engine, and the messaging layer, you reach markets that ChatGPT can only dream of accessing. The visibility is total, the reach is planetary. Media coverage rewards novelty relentlessly. Every model release becomes a headline, and every benchmark win becomes a story. Every viral demonstration, whether it is a chatbot writing poetry, generating images, or solving complex problems, becomes content that drives engagement and attention. The narrative machine is optimized for spectacle. New is newsworthy and better is newsworthy. Incremental improvements in token throughput or reasoning capability become the primary subject of industry analysis and investor presentations. This creates a feedback loop. Visibility generates attention, which generates investment, which then generates capability. Capability generates even more visibility. The cycle reinforces itself, and observers naturally conclude that whoever is winning the visibility war is winning the actual war. This conclusion is structurally wrong. Enterprise AI adoption operates on a completely different timeline than consumer adoption. Consumer AI adoption follows a hockey stick curve of exponential growth, measured in millions of new users per quarter and visible in real-time market share reports. Enterprise AI adoption follows a sigmoid curve, starting with a slow initial phase before gradual acceleration and an eventual plateau. Pilots take months, procurement takes months, and deployment takes years. The economic value accumulates silently in spreadsheets and internal metrics that never become public. This timeline mismatch creates the visibility trap. Consumer AI appears to be winning because adoption is visible and fast, while enterprise AI appears to be stagnant because adoption is invisible and slow. Market observers naturally extrapolate from what they can see. They assume ChatGPT is winning because its adoption is visible, and they assume Microsoft is struggling because Copilot adoption appears slow. The architectural reality is inverted. Enterprise AI revenue is not just larger than consumer AI revenue, it is orders of magnitude larger. A single enterprise AI contract can be worth millions of dollars annually, and a single regulated industry deployment can lock in a customer for years. The economic value in the enterprise space is so much larger than the consumer space that comparing them is almost meaningless. It is like comparing the revenue from selling smartphones to the revenue from selling telecommunications infrastructure. One is visible and glamorous, while the other is invisible and economically dominant. Microsoft's strategy is deliberately obscured in enterprise infrastructure, away from the consumer spotlight and away from competitive pressure. This invisibility is not accidental, it is architectural, it is intentional. The market is measuring the wrong metric. It is measuring visibility and confusing it with dominance. It is measuring consumer preference and assuming it predicts enterprise behavior. It is measuring quarterly headline share and assuming it predicts long-term market control. Meanwhile, the actual war, the infrastructure war, the control plane war, and the enterprise consolidation war is happening in boardrooms and procurement meetings. It is happening in compliance frameworks and data architecture decisions that will lock in winners for the next decade. Most observers are still watching the interface, the architecture of enterprise capture. To understand why Microsoft holds its current position, we have to look at how enterprise AI actually functions in the real world. The deployment of enterprise AI depends on three foundational pillars: identity, data, and infrastructure. Identity defines who can access specific systems, while data dictates how information flows and stays protected under governance frameworks. Infrastructure provides the actual processing power and the compliance certifications required to operate. When these three layers fail to work together, AI remains a laboratory curiosity, but when they are fully integrated, AI becomes an operational necessity. Microsoft controls all three. Most observers analyze Microsoft 365 as a productivity suite, but that is a foundational misunderstanding of the platform. In reality, Microsoft 365 serves as the identity and workflow layer for 400 million commercial users. Every time an employee logs into Outlook or collaborates in Teams, they are moving through a control plane that dictates exactly what they can see and do. This system is not just about software. It is the architectural engine through which enterprises manage their people and their permissions at scale. Azure is not a generic cloud provider selling commodity computing resources to the highest bidder. It is the infrastructure layer where regulated enterprises actually run their AI workloads, and that distinction matters enormously for the future of the industry. While a startup can run its models on any cloud it chooses, a hospital or a government agency does not have that luxury. These organizations require data residency controls and audit trails that are architectural prerequisites rather than optional features. Azure OpenAI service provides the HIPAA compliance and FedRAMP authorization that regulated industries demand before they even consider adoption. Microsoft Fabric serves as the data architecture layer by consolidating data lakes and real-time analytics into a single control plane. AI models only provide value when data is accessible and governed, and while competitors like Snowflake or BigQuery might offer better query optimization, they lack deep integration with the identity and workflow layers. The real architectural advantage here is not the underlying technology, but rather an integration depth that competitors cannot replicate without rebuilding their entire platforms from scratch. This is the structural reality. Data gravity creates a moat that persists even when competitors have superior technology. Enterprise data is not portable because it lives inside SharePoint, Teams, and Dynamics 365, where it is protected by existing identity layers. For a competitor to win, they must convince an enterprise to move its entire data estate, which is an almost impossible task given the operational risks involved. Google's Gemini might offer a superior context window of 2 million tokens, but that technical achievement is meaningless if the model cannot access the data living inside the Microsoft ecosystem. The architectural reality is that having the data already in place is a far greater advantage than having a slightly better model. This explains why regulated industries are consolidating on Azure OpenAI instead of chasing best-of-breed models from other providers. The economic decision is rarely about model performance, but is instead focused on architectural integration and the total cost of ownership. When you factor in governance and operational support, the choice to stay within the existing ecosystem becomes inevitable. The enterprise flywheel functions through a specific chain of events. Identity determines access, and access determines what data is available for the AI to use. That available data then dictates what workflows can be automated, which ultimately drives the organizational productivity that creates a competitive advantage. Each layer reinforces the others, creating a system where better data leads to better automation and better intelligence. Competitors can try to compete at individual layers, but they cannot compete across the entire integrated system. This is why Microsoft is winning. The OpenAI partnership as financial moat. The OpenAI partnership is often framed as a simple technology play, but focusing on whether GPT-4o is better than Gemini misses the point entirely. Observers spend their time debating model capability and reasoning skills while ignoring the actual strategic value of the arrangement. The OpenAI partnership is a financial architecture. Microsoft currently holds an equity stake of approximately 27% in OpenAI, which reached a valuation of $135 billion after the 2025 recapitalization. While that stake makes the investment significant on paper, the equity is not the primary driver of value for the company. The real power lies in the revenue structure. Under the current terms, Microsoft receives 20% of OpenAI's total revenue through the year 2032. This is a guaranteed revenue stream that remains independent of market share or model performance, acting as a structural hedge against any competitive outcome. Even if OpenAI loses ground to Anthropic or faces intense regulatory pressure, Microsoft still captures a fifth of their top-line revenue. This arrangement ensures that Microsoft profits from the growth of the industry leader without being fully exposed to its operational risks. More importantly, OpenAI is contractually obligated to purchase $250 billion in incremental Azure services over the term of the partnership. This is not a casual handshake agreement. It is a locked-in commitment that forces OpenAI to run its training and inference workloads on Azure infrastructure. By securing this deal, Microsoft ensured that the massive scale of OpenAI's compute needs would directly feed its own cloud growth for years to come. This single commitment fundamentally transformed Microsoft's financial position and provided unprecedented forward visibility. The company's commercial backlog jumped from $392 billion to $625 billion, and the OpenAI commitment accounted for nearly half of that massive $233 billion increase. To put that in perspective, a single partnership added more future revenue to Microsoft's books than most Fortune 500 companies generate in an entire year. The revenue structure creates a virtuous cycle where OpenAI's success directly inflates Microsoft's cloud revenue through increased Azure consumption. As OpenAI scales its business and processes more data, Microsoft captures value through the revenue share and the infrastructure fees simultaneously. This is not a zero-sum negotiation between two companies, but rather a compounding mutual benefit that rewards Microsoft at every stage of growth. Microsoft has invested $13 billion across multiple phases since 2019, and the return on that capital is now contractually locked in. The investment thesis was straightforward. If OpenAI becomes valuable, Microsoft wins through equity, and if OpenAI's infrastructure needs grow, Microsoft wins through Azure. If the models power new enterprise applications, Microsoft captures that value through Copilot licensing and AI services. The partnership structure ensures that Microsoft wins regardless of which specific market outcome eventually materializes. If OpenAI dominates the market, the revenue share grows, and if their infrastructure needs explode, Azure consumption scales alongside them. Even if the focus shifts entirely to enterprise applications, Microsoft is positioned to capture that value through its existing software ecosystem. This is not a technology partnership. It is a capital structure designed to ensure Microsoft wins. The market often views this partnership as a potential risk, wondering what might happen if OpenAI develops independent capabilities or if the relationship frays. These concerns ignore the structural reality that the financial architecture is now so deeply integrated that a separation would be economically irrational for both sides. OpenAI cannot afford to lose the world's most reliable infrastructure provider, and Microsoft will not walk away from a guaranteed revenue stream worth billions. The partnership is not a temporary arrangement between two tech companies. It is a structural lock-in mechanism disguised as a collaboration. This financial moat is the reason Microsoft can confidently invest $80 billion in AI infrastructure while others are still hesitating. Because the revenue is already committed and the return on investment is contractually guaranteed, Microsoft is not speculating on whether AI will be important. They are simply building the infrastructure that OpenAI is already legally obligated to consume. Competitors cannot replicate this structure because the financial architecture is exclusive to Microsoft's position in the market. Google cannot negotiate a $250 billion consumption commitment from a partner, and Amazon cannot secure a similar revenue share from a leader like OpenAI. Microsoft is winning the capital allocation war before the technology war has even been decided. The Capex moat and infrastructure dominance. Financial structures only matter if you can actually execute on them, and Microsoft's massive capital expenditure proves they can. For 2025, the company planned $80 billion in capital spending, with even more acceleration projected into 2026. This is not a marketing budget or a research and development fund. 2/3 of that $80 billion allocation goes specifically toward GPUs and AI infrastructure. That means about $53 billion is being poured into the physical hardware and massive power systems necessary to run AI workloads at scale. This level of spending is not a theoretical projection because it is happening right now in data centers across every major region. These resources are being configured into specialized clusters designed specifically for OpenAI's model training and inference requirements. The entire system is being architected for redundancy and compliance to meet the strict regulatory needs of enterprises in healthcare, finance, and government. Google's capital commitment of $75 billion for 2025 appears competitive on the surface since the numbers are in the same ballpark. However, the actual allocation tells a very different story. Google has to distribute its spending across search infrastructure, Android development, YouTube video serving, and various cloud services. While their focus on AI is significant, it is not the dominant singular allocation that we see from Microsoft. Microsoft is making a massive concentrated bet by putting 2/3 of their Capex into GPU and AI infrastructure. This creates a physical advantage that compounds over time because more GPUs lead to more training capacity and faster model iteration. Having more infrastructure also means better redundancy and higher service reliability. When reliability goes up, more enterprise customers feel they can finally trust the platform with their most mission-critical workloads. This infrastructure lead is structural rather than temporary. Competitors cannot simply replicate this overnight without a similar massive capital deployment. Building data centers and procuring specialized GPUs takes years, just as training infrastructure engineers and configuring clusters for compliance takes time. Microsoft is spending the money now, ensuring the advantage they built today will persist for a long time. Azure infrastructure now serves as the exclusive hosting environment for OpenAI's models until a formal declaration of AGI. This is not just a marketing partnership, it is a fundamental architectural requirement. OpenAI's models run on Azure, their training happens on Azure, and their inference happens on Azure. The infrastructure advantage is literally baked into the contractual structure of the partnership. Microsoft even built top 5 supercomputers specifically for OpenAI training purposes. These are not commodity data centers, but rather purpose-built systems designed for the extreme computational demands of training frontier models. The engineering effort and capital required to build these systems are both enormous. Once these systems exist, they create a competitive moat because OpenAI cannot easily migrate to another provider without rebuilding everything from scratch. The switching cost is simply prohibitive. This scale of spending creates a moat that most competitors cannot realistically match. Google can spend $75 billion and Amazon can spend $100 billion, but spending alone does not create a win. The specific allocation and the timing of the investment matter just as much as the integration with existing platforms. Microsoft's spending is tightly integrated with the existing Azure ecosystem. New GPU clusters connect directly into established data center networks and inherit existing identity systems, compliance frameworks, and operational tooling. This capital deployment adds to an existing advantage instead of trying to build a new one from nothing. Many competitors are building their infrastructure in isolation without that same level of integration. They might create raw capability, but they lack the structural advantage of connecting AI to productivity platforms or workflow engines. This infrastructure lead translates directly into better reliability, lower latency, and easier regulatory compliance for the end user. This explains why Microsoft can confidently accelerate their spending. The infrastructure they are building today is already obligated to be consumed through OpenAI's contractual commitments. They aren't speculating on whether this hardware will be valuable because the capacity is already spoken for. The Capex moat allows Microsoft to outspend everyone else without the same level of financial risk. The data gravity principle. Enterprise data is not portable, and that is the foundational principle explaining why Microsoft's dominance is structural. Data tends to live exactly where it was created. It lives in Microsoft 365, in SharePoint repositories where documents have piled up for years, and in OneDrive, where employees store their daily work. It lives in Teams conversations and Dynamics 365 records. This data is not just sitting in storage. It is protected by identity layers that control access and governed by compliance frameworks that dictate how it can be used. It is woven into operational workflows that determine how information flows through the entire company. Moving this data out of the ecosystem is not a simple technical task. It is a massive organizational nightmare. When a company considers a new AI platform, they face a difficult choice. They can consolidate their data into a new system, which requires migration, validation, and retraining the entire workforce. Or they can keep their data where it is and integrate the new AI platform with their existing architecture. The first option is economically irrational for almost any large business. Data migration is expensive, risky, and creates significant downtime. For a large enterprise with petabytes of data spread across hundreds of systems, migration is not just a project. It is a multi-year transformation effort that most leadership teams want to avoid. The second option is the only one that makes sense. Keep the data where it sits. Microsoft understands this principle better than anyone else. Azure OpenAI service is designed to work natively with data in SharePoint, OneDrive, and Dynamics. The AI models can access the information where it already lives without moving a single file. This creates a massive advantage over competitors who require you to move your data to their platforms first. Google's Gemini has superior context windows, offering 2 million tokens compared to the much smaller limit on GPT-4o. In a laboratory environment, being able to analyze longer documents and maintain more history is a meaningful advantage. However, context is essentially meaningless if the model cannot reach the data. The superior context window cannot see the data living inside the Microsoft ecosystem. An enterprise using Gemini would have to extract data from Microsoft 365, transform it, and send it to Google's infrastructure for processing. This is not true integration. It is a separate, fragmented system. Data gravity explains why enterprises consolidate on the platforms where their information already resides. This is not vendor lock-in in the traditional sense, but rather rational economic behavior. The cost of moving data is so high that staying with the incumbent is often the only logical choice. This principle only gets stronger over time. As companies put more data into the Microsoft ecosystem and integrate more workflows, the switching cost continues to climb. Every new employee trained on these tools makes the moat deeper and wider. Competitors can build better models or faster data warehouses, but they cannot easily touch the data that enterprises have already consolidated. Data gravity ensures that Microsoft's dominance persists, even when other companies have technically superior features. This is exactly why regulated industries choose Azure OpenAI over other best-of-breed models. The decision is rarely about which model performs better in a vacuum. It is about data accessibility, architectural integration, and the total cost of ownership. The data gravity principle is a structural moat that compounds every time a company saves another file to the cloud. Microsoft 365 Copilot as distribution engine. Microsoft 365 Copilot is not a standalone product, and that is the critical distinction most market observers seem to miss. You have to understand that Microsoft is not actually competing with ChatGPT for the hearts and minds of the consumer market. They aren't trying to win a popularity contest. Instead, they are embedding an AI engine directly into the productivity layer that 400 million commercial users already live in every single day. This is a distribution advantage that has no equivalent in the software industry. In architectural terms, a distribution advantage means you reach the customer through existing plumbing rather than waiting for a new procurement cycle. When Microsoft pushes a new feature into Excel, it instantly lands in front of 400 million people who already hold the keys. Compare that to Google releasing a feature in Sheets to a much smaller installed base, or Anthropic releasing Claude to users who have to go out of their way to find it. Those delivery pipelines are fundamentally different. Copilot reaches the enterprise through existing software licenses, which means it bypasses the friction of a new purchasing decision entirely. If an organization has 10,000 Microsoft 365 seats, they can flip a switch and enable Copilot for every one of those users tomorrow morning. The licensing infrastructure is already there, the identity system is already running, and the data governance frameworks are already locked down. Adding Copilot is an additive move for the IT department, not a disruptive one. This structural advantage creates adoption curves that look nothing like the viral explosions we see in the consumer world. Consumer AI adoption is usually binary, meaning a person either signs up for the app or they don't. Enterprise adoption is a much slower, more deliberate process where organizations start with small pilots before moving to specific departments. Eventually, they expand to the broader population over time, so the curve reflects organizational inertia rather than individual excitement. The current state of Microsoft 365 Copilot reflects this reality perfectly. After 2 years, 15 million paid seats represents only about 3% of the total commercial base, leading many observers to claim the product is failing. They look at ChatGPT's 200 million users and declare a total victory for the consumer product, but that comparison is structurally wrong. The metric that actually matters is the Copilot attachment rate to existing Microsoft 365 licenses. When you measure how many existing customers are adding the AI service, the story changes completely. Organizations are currently moving from those initial pilots into much larger deployments, and that timeline is dictated by corporate policy. Pilots take months to evaluate, expansions take months to fund, and mainstream adoption across a global firm usually takes years. Market analysts are confusing low seat penetration with a lack of interest, but in reality they are just watching the early majority phase of a massive rollout. This is the specific point in time where companies have finished their testing and are starting to open the gates for everyone else. The typical timeline from a pilot to full mainstream use is 18 to 24 months, and we are sitting right in the middle of that window. The distribution mode isn't about brand visibility, it is about contractual inevitability. Since enterprises already pay for the Microsoft stack and have their security perimeters defined, adding Copilot isn't a risky new procurement move. It is simply a license upgrade decision where the friction is lower and the switching cost is almost non-existent. This makes the adoption timeline much faster than it would ever be for a standalone standalone tool trying to break into the building. This is exactly why Microsoft can confidently project that Copilot attachment will hit 25% of their enterprise base by mid-2026. These numbers aren't just aspirational marketing fluff because they are based on the actual expansion patterns seen in the telemetry of current pilots. Organizations are moving forward with these deployments because the integration is seamless, the data is already accessible, and the disruption to the daily workflow is almost zero. No competitor can easily replicate this kind of distribution advantage. ChatGPT has to convince a CISO to adopt an entirely new tool, while Google Workspace has to convince a company to switch their entire productivity platform. Anthropic faces the same uphill battle of new procurement, new integrations, and new training for every single sale. Microsoft doesn't have to deal with any of that friction. Copilot is already sitting inside the tools people use for 8 hours a day, and it is already connected to the data that the company has spent years governing. The decision for the executive isn't whether to adopt a brand new system, but whether to turn on a powerful feature in the system they already own. This structural lead is why Copilot will eventually see attachment rates of 50% or higher across the entire Microsoft 365 ecosystem. It won't happen because the user experience is magically superior or because it wins a consumer survey. It will happen because Copilot is the default option for the world's largest organizations. The distribution moat is a structural force that compounds as more organizations enable the service and more workflows become dependent on it. As that happens, more data flows through the engine, which increases the value of the system and deepens the moat even further. Microsoft's entire strategy is to embed AI into the platforms that already exist, rather than trying to build a standalone winner. In the enterprise market, the distribution channel is always more important than the individual excellence of the product. Since Microsoft already owns the channel, they effectively own the market. The adoption gap as narrative misdirection. This is the exact point where most market observers make their biggest mistake. Survey data from the last year shows a pattern that looks like a massive red flag for Microsoft's AI ambitions. In environments where workers can choose any tool they want, Copilot's popularity drops off a cliff. When employees have the freedom to pick between Copilot and ChatGPT, the preference for Microsoft's tool sits at 18%, while ChatGPT dominates at 76%. That gap isn't just a small lead, it is a total blowout that creates a very convincing narrative of failure. The argument is that despite having 400 million seats and native integration, Microsoft is losing because users simply don't like the product. If the distribution advantage hasn't translated into user preference, then the logic suggests that Copilot is destined to fail in the long run. That narrative is very easy to believe because the data behind it is technically true, but it misses the architectural reality of how companies actually work. Preference data from unrestricted environments is a terrible predictor of how an enterprise will behave. In a controlled corporate environment where Copilot is the only authorized tool, the adoption rates frequently soar past 70%. When the organization removes the noise and designates a single standard, workers adopt it at a rate that matches the most successful software launches in history. They use it to get their work done, they find ways to integrate it into their tasks, and they report real productivity gains. The massive spread between 18% preference and 70% adoption tells us something fundamental about the software business. Workers might prefer ChatGPT when they are playing around with different tools, but they adopt Copilot when it becomes the official way to do their jobs. This isn't a failure of the technology, it's just a clear look at how enterprise mandates function. Enterprise software is not a consumer meritocracy driven by personal taste. It is driven by organizational standards that dictate which tools are used for which tasks. People use Outlook because it is the company email, and they use Teams because that is where the meetings happen. Once a leadership team makes a decision, the question of whether an individual prefers a different interface becomes completely irrelevant to the bottom line. Microsoft isn't trying to win a popularity contest with college students or casual users. Their goal is to make Copilot the default setting for the global workforce. Once that happens, adoption is guaranteed by the mandate of the organization rather than the choice of the consumer. The adoption gap narrative is focused on the wrong game entirely. While observers are busy counting hearts and minds in surveys, Microsoft is busy securing the infrastructure layer where the actual work happens. They are winning the war for the foundation of the enterprise, while their competitors are still fighting for the surface-level interface. Most analysts are measuring the wrong metric and assuming it tells them something about the future of the platform. They see ChatGPT's 76% preference and declare a winner, but they are ignoring the fact that enterprise adoption is a top-down process. This is why the 35% attachment goal for 2026 is so realistic. It doesn't require every worker to fall in love with the software. It only requires the organization to designate it as the standard tool for the job. Once that policy is in place, the usage follows automatically. The adoption gap isn't a sign of weakness, but a form of narrative misdirection that keeps people from seeing the real strategy. Microsoft is winning the infrastructure war while everyone else is distracted by the interface war. The gap doesn't prove they are losing. It proves they are playing a different game. Azure OpenAI service as regulatory moat. Regulated industries cannot simply choose to use public cloud AI services based on preference. For these organizations, compliance is a legal mandate that dictates every architectural decision. A hospital, for example, is strictly prohibited from deploying a standard ChatGPT instance to analyze patient records because that data falls under the rigid protection of HIPAA. The law is explicit. Patient information must be encrypted at rest and in transit. Every access point must be logged for audits, and data residency must be strictly maintained within the United States. Because ChatGPT operates as a public service where data can flow outside these boundaries, uploading patient files would result in an immediate regulatory violation. Financial institutions face similar walls when considering tools like Gemini for analyzing trading patterns or sensitive customer information. These entities operate under SEC regulations and banking frameworks that require financial data to be completely segregated from consumer data. They need granular access controls and exhaustive audit trails that prove their information isn't being commingled with data from other customers. Since Gemini functions as a public service, any financial firm uploading data to it would find themselves in breach of federal requirements the moment the send button is hit. Government agencies are perhaps the most restricted, as they cannot use Claude to process classified or sensitive information that must remain within government-controlled infrastructure. Federal information security standards demand that classified data never leaves authorized environments and that access remains restricted to cleared personnel using specific encryption levels. Claude operates as a public service, meaning any classified data uploaded to its servers would violate federal law immediately. These are not niche edge cases. These are the exact industries where enterprise AI adoption carries the most weight. Healthcare generates massive datasets that are ripe for AI analysis, while finance produces transactional data that could offer incredible insights if processed correctly. Government agencies operate at a scale where AI could drive massive efficiency gains, making these sectors the primary drivers of future economic value. Despite this potential, these are also the very industries that are fundamentally blocked from using standard public cloud AI services. Azure OpenAI service solves this architectural deadlock by offering private deployments, strict data residency, and mature compliance certifications. When a healthcare provider deploys this service, the models run on dedicated infrastructure sitting inside their own Azure subscription. The data never leaves their perimeter, the organization retains full control over encryption keys, and the audit trails remain entirely under their management. This deployment is HIPAA compliant because Microsoft architected the system to meet those specific legal requirements from the ground up. Financial firms and government agencies follow the same pattern when they move their workloads to Azure. The models run on isolated or government-authorized infrastructure where data stays within controlled environments and access is managed by the agency itself. These deployments meet SEC and federal security standards because the underlying architecture was designed to satisfy auditors, not just developers. While competitors are currently trying to build their own compliance frameworks, Microsoft's head start is measured in years rather than months. Google is still working toward HIPAA compliance for Gemini, and Anthropic is only now building out the capabilities Claude needs for the enterprise. Azure OpenAI service has already been live in these regulated environments for over a year, meaning the certifications are mature and the operational experience is deep. This regulatory moat is structural and architectural. Once an enterprise achieves compliance on Azure, they cannot simply switch to a competitor without recertifying their entire AI infrastructure. If a hospital has spent months proving to auditors that their Azure deployment is secure, moving to a different provider would force them to start that grueling process all over again. The true switching cost isn't the price of the subscription, it is the organizational and temporal cost of a recertification process that can take years to complete. This reality explains why regulated industries are consolidating on Azure OpenAI, even when other models might seem more advanced on paper. The decision isn't about which model has the best benchmarks, but rather which platform offers the most certain compliance guarantees. Organizations value the operational peace of mind that comes with a platform that has already survived the scrutiny of federal and industry auditors. The moat only deepens as more enterprises adopt the service and create a growing library of successful case studies and operational patterns. Each new deployment builds more confidence in the platform, allowing Microsoft to invest in Azure infrastructure at a scale that competitors struggle to match. The revenue from these sectors is stable, large, and contractually committed, creating a competitive advantage that is nearly impossible to replicate quickly. Building customer confidence and operational experience takes time, and Microsoft has already paid that price. Microsoft Fabric as data architecture control. While compliance and deployment provide the initial entry point, long-term dominance in the AI market requires control over the data layer itself. Microsoft Fabric is often misunderstood as just another data warehouse, but it is actually a unified data architecture designed to pull enterprise information into a single control plane. It serves as the foundational infrastructure layer that allows enterprise AI to function at scale. The architectural reality is that AI models are only as valuable as the data they can access and understand. A sophisticated model running against a mess of unorganized data will produce poor results, while a simpler model paired with well-structured data can generate incredible value. In the world of enterprise implementation, the architecture of the data matters far more than the sophistication of the LLM being used. Organizations cannot deploy high-level AI without first solving their data architecture problems, which is a massive operational hurdle. Most companies spend months preparing their data before an AI project even begins, as they have to standardize formats and establish governance frameworks. They must create audit trails and implement access controls across dozens of different systems, often making the preparation phase longer than the actual AI implementation. Microsoft Fabric addresses this by consolidating data lakes, warehouses, and real-time analytics into one platform that is natively integrated with Microsoft 365. This isn't just a convenience for the user, it is an architectural necessity for the system. When data lives in Fabric, it becomes immediately visible to Copilot without the need for complex connectors or data movement. Workflows built in the Power Platform or dashboards created in Power BI can tap into this data directly, removing the need for intermediate layers or constant transformations. Competitors like Snowflake or BigQuery often offer superior query optimization or better support for unstructured data in a laboratory setting. These are legitimate technical wins, and on specific metrics, those platforms frequently outperform Fabric. However, they lack the deep integration with the identity and productivity layers where the actual work happens. When an enterprise uses a third-party warehouse, they are forced to extract data from Microsoft 365, transform it, and load it into a separate system before they can even begin analysis. This is not true integration. It is a fragmented workflow that requires moving data and duplicating security policies across different environments. In contrast, Fabric allows the data to stay within a unified architecture that is already tied to the organization's identity system and workflow engines. This creates a compounding advantage where the more an enterprise uses Fabric, the more valuable Copilot and Azure OpenAI become to their daily operations. As these AI tools prove their worth, the organization is further incentivized to move more data into the Fabric environment. This cycle reinforces itself every quarter, making the platform more indispensable to the enterprise with every new data set added. The true advantage here isn't the underlying technology, but the depth of integration that competitors cannot match without rebuilding their entire stacks. While Snowflake could try to build identity integration, they would have to overhaul their core architecture to reach the level of native connectivity Microsoft has spent years developing. The time and cost required for a competitor to catch up is so high that it becomes a functional impossibility for most. This explains why we see enterprises moving their data into Fabric even if they were previously happy with Snowflake or BigQuery. The benefits of a unified integration outweigh the marginal gains of technical performance, especially when the total cost of ownership is lower. Organizations are discovering that their old fragmented data architectures are simply inadequate for the AI era. This shift isn't traditional vendor lock-in, but rather a rational economic choice made by architects who want to enable better AI outcomes. The cost of keeping data fragmented across multiple systems is becoming too high to justify, making consolidation on a unified architecture the only logical path forward. This control over the data layer is structural, and it is the primary reason Microsoft is winning the battle for the infrastructure layer. Power Platform automation and citizen developer amplification. Data architecture is not just about storage. It enables the next layer of organizational amplification through citizen developers. The Power Platform, which includes Power Apps, Power Automate, and Power BI, allows non-technical workers to build AI-augmented applications without needing deep technical expertise. This is not some niche capability for hobbyists. In reality, it is a mechanism for organizational force multiplication at scale. When you combine these tools with Copilot and Azure OpenAI, the Power Platform becomes a way to distribute AI capability across an entire company instead of hoarding it within data science teams. The architectural insight here is that your citizen developers are already licensed through Microsoft 365. They already possess identity access, and they already operate within your existing data governance frameworks. Adding AI capability to the Power Platform is an incremental step rather than a transformational hurdle. An organization with 10,000 Microsoft 365 seats suddenly finds itself with 10,000 potential AI application builders, creating a distribution advantage that is simply enormous. Competitors like Salesforce or Mendix certainly offer compelling low-code platforms and sophisticated workflow automation. These platforms are technically superior in specific dimensions, offering better performance for certain workloads or more granular customization options. However, they lack native integration with the enterprise identity and productivity layers where your employees actually work. When a developer builds in those ecosystems, the applications remain isolated from Microsoft 365 workflows, requiring synchronized data and bridged identity systems that create significant integration friction. When a citizen developer builds with the Power Platform, they are working within a unified ecosystem. The application has native access to Microsoft 365 data, the identity system is already established, and the governance frameworks are inherited automatically. Because an application built in Power Apps can directly consume SharePoint data and authenticate users through Entra ID, it can trigger workflows in Power Automate that send Teams notifications without any architectural friction. Power Platform adoption is growing at an exponential rate. Millions of applications are being built annually, and that pace is only accelerating because Copilot is now embedded directly into the creation workflows. A developer can now describe what they want to build using natural language, allowing Copilot to generate the application structure for them to refine and deploy. The barrier to entry has never been lower, which means the speed of adoption has never been faster. This creates a compounding effect within the enterprise. As more citizen developers use the Power Platform, more applications are created, which causes more enterprise data to flow into the system. This makes Copilot and Azure OpenAI more valuable to the business, which in turn encourages even more developers to adopt the platform. The cycle reinforces itself. The long-term advantage here is structural. Enterprises that adopt the Power Platform plus Copilot become fundamentally dependent on Microsoft's infrastructure for their daily operations. The workflows they create and the data they consolidate all flow through these integrated systems, meaning that switching to a competitor would require rebuilding thousands of custom applications. The switching cost is not just high, it is prohibitive. Microsoft is investing heavily in these capabilities because every new feature increases the total value of the ecosystem. Every new Copilot integration reduces the friction of development, and every new connector expands the data sources the platform can touch. The platform becomes more indispensable with every single iteration. Other companies are building low-code tools, but they are not building them with this level of integration into identity and productivity engines. This architectural advantage is structural and compounds over time, making it nearly impossible for others to replicate. Citizen developer amplification is why Microsoft can confidently project that adoption will accelerate through 2026. Organizations that have already consolidated on Microsoft 365 and Azure OpenAI are discovering that the Power Platform is the natural next step. It is the place where they actually build the applications that leverage their consolidated data. This is the mechanism through which dominance compounds. Identity enables data access and data enables AI capability. AI then enables workflow automation, which leads to citizen developer amplification and organizational dependence. That dependence creates a structural lock-in that ensures long-term dominance. Dynamics 365 AI integration as revenue intelligence. Automation at the application layer is critical for efficiency, but true revenue intelligence requires deep operational data. This is where Dynamics 365 enters the architecture. Dynamics 365 acts as the operational system of record for sales, service, and supply chain processes. When a salesperson logs an opportunity or a service rep closes a ticket, that data flows directly into Dynamics 365. It is not a mere reporting tool, it is the environment where business operations actually happen and where revenue is either generated or lost. Today, Dynamics 365 exclusively uses Azure OpenAI for its AI features. Revenue intelligence and predictive analytics are now powered by models running on Microsoft infrastructure, which is an architectural shift rather than a simple feature addition. This means AI is no longer a separate tool that analysts use to supplement their work, but is instead embedded directly into the business processes where the data originates. The operational reality is that AI-powered revenue intelligence is only as valuable as the data it touches. A model trained on generic sales data will only ever generate generic insights. However, a model operating on your actual customer interactions and deal history generates insights specific to your business, making the value proportional to the data relevance. Competitors like Salesforce or HubSpot offer technically competent CRM platforms with sophisticated automation or better user experiences. They offer real value to their customers, yet they lack the integration with the identity and productivity layers that Microsoft controls. When a Salesforce user needs to share a customer insight, they often have to export data and manually move it into a document or email. A Microsoft 365 user simply references that data directly in Teams, allowing the insight to flow through a unified ecosystem with minimal friction. Dynamics 365 adoption is growing specifically in regulated industries where compliance and integration are non-negotiable. A financial services organization that has consolidated on Microsoft 365 and Fabric will find that Dynamics 365 is the natural next step for their operational data. The AI capability comes from Azure OpenAI, the analysis happens in Power BI, and the collaboration happens in teams. The total cost of ownership is lower because you aren't paying to maintain separate, disconnected systems. The real advantage of Dynamics 365 is not the CRM functionality itself. Basic sales automation and opportunity tracking are just table stakes in this market. The true value is the integration with the identity and AI layers. When data flows into Power BI, it is automatically secured by Entra ID. And when insights are shared in teams, they are governed by existing compliance frameworks. The long-term advantage for the enterprise is organizational. Companies that consolidate on Dynamics 365 and Copilot create a closed loop where AI improves business outcomes directly. The salesperson receives an AI-generated insight about a customer, they act on it, and the resulting deal flows back into the system. This data then feeds back into the AI model to make the next insight even more accurate. This creates a virtuous cycle that persists for years. Each quarter, the AI models improve because they are operating on more recent and relevant data. The revenue impact increases as the insights sharpen, and the organizational dependence on the system deepens because the business outcomes are tied to the AI capability. Competitors cannot easily replicate this cycle because building integrated CRM and productivity systems requires an architectural coherence that takes years to develop. While Salesforce could theoretically build equivalent integration, they would have to rebuild their entire platform around Microsoft's identity system. The time required for such a shift is measured in years, and the cost is simply too high for most to consider. This is why Dynamics 365 adoption will continue to accelerate into 2026 and beyond. Organizations that have already committed to the Microsoft stack are discovering that Dynamics 365 closes the loop between data and business outcomes. It is the place where revenue intelligence finally becomes an operational reality. The enterprise flywheel effect. Every integration point we have analyzed creates value on its own. But when you look at them together, they form a compounding system that gains momentum every quarter. This is the enterprise flywheel. It is not a collection of features. It is an architectural inevitability where identity determines the boundaries of the entire stack. When an employee logs into Microsoft 365, Entra ID authenticates them and immediately defines the perimeter of what they can see. That access dictates exactly what data is available to the system, and that available data is the only fuel the AI models are allowed to consume. Because Azure OpenAI can only generate insights from information the user is permitted to touch, the AI's capability sets the ceiling for what the Power Platform can actually automate. These automated workflows then dictate the organization's productivity, freeing people from manual labor so they can focus on higher value tasks. Ultimately, that productivity becomes a competitive advantage, allowing companies to make faster decisions and respond to market shifts, while their slower competitors are still digging through fragmented spreadsheets. Each layer in this stack reinforces the others, and this is the critical architectural insight you need to understand. Better data leads to better automation, especially when Fabric pulls information from a dozen sources into one unified architecture for the Power Platform to use. Instead of building workflows on top of broken fragmented data, Power Automate can finally operate on a complete picture of the business. This creates a feedback loop where better automation actually generates better data, capturing every transaction record and decision log to feed back into the engine. The data grows richer, the AI models train on higher quality inputs, and the resulting intelligence allows managers to allocate resources with a level of precision that was previously impossible. The flywheel is not a theoretical concept, and you can see it clearly in organizations that have fully committed to the Microsoft stack. One financial services firm that deployed Copilot, Fabric, and Dynamics 365 together found that the compounding effect actually accelerated how fast their employees adopted the new tools. Their initial pilots were small, focusing on basic things like summarizing emails or taking meeting notes, but the real value appeared during the integration phase. Once Copilot could reach into Fabric to answer complex questions about customer behavior and Power Automate could trigger actions based on those AI insights, the operational data became truly actionable. Competitors can still try to fight at individual layers of this stack. Salesforce might offer a CRM with more bells and whistles, and Snowflake or Databricks might win on specific performance metrics for data warehousing or machine learning. These are legitimate advantages in a vacuum, but those vendors cannot compete with the entire system once the flywheel is spinning. When a company consolidates on Microsoft, they gain structural advantages because the identity system, the data architecture, and the AI capabilities are all natively connected. The real architectural advantage isn't found in any single product, but in the integration depth that makes the cost of switching almost impossible to justify. If you have built Power Platform apps that pull from Fabric, trigger Dynamics 365 workflows, and send Teams notifications through Entra ID, you are no longer just using a tool. You have built an ecosystem. Switching to a competitor would mean rebuilding every application, migrating petabytes of data, and retraining retraining an entire workforce while reconfiguring every compliance framework you own. That move would cost millions of dollars and cause months of total organizational disruption. This reality explains why enterprise cloud spending is concentrating so heavily on Microsoft right now. The return on investment compounds as you integrate more layers, leading to faster deployment and lower costs than a best-of-breed strategy could ever offer. The economic logic is hard to argue with because consolidation removes the friction of manual integration. It reduces complexity, improves the flow of information, and ultimately lowers the total cost of ownership for the entire IT department. This flywheel effect is not a temporary trend, and it will only accelerate as Microsoft adds more connection points to the ecosystem. Every new capability added to Copilot increases the value of the data sitting in Fabric, and every new feature in Fabric expands what the Power Platform can automate. The system becomes more valuable with every update, which means the switching costs go up and the competitive moat gets deeper. Microsoft's dominance persists because the flywheel is structural and compounding. A competitor cannot simply disrupt this by releasing a better app. They would have to rebuild an entire integrated universe from scratch. That task would require billions in capital and thousands of engineers working for years just to catch up. By the time anyone else could build a similar integrated system, Microsoft will have already moved the flywheel even further ahead. The sovereign AI play and geopolitical advantage. The domestic flywheel is a powerful engine, but global geopolitical shifts are reshaping AI strategy in a way that makes Microsoft's position even more secure. We are seeing the rise of sovereign AI, which refers to models and infrastructure controlled by national governments rather than American tech giants. This isn't just a talking point for policy wonks, it is a regulatory reality that is already accelerating across Europe and Asia. Governments are now passing laws that require AI data and the underlying hardware to stay within their own national borders. France wants sensitive government data processed on French soil, Germany has strict mandates for financial data, and India is building its own capabilities to stop relying so heavily on US firms. Even China has built a completely separate AI world. This regulatory pressure is only going to intensify, and more countries will likely follow suit by implementing their own strict sovereignty requirements in the next few years. This creates a massive problem for most US tech companies because building separate data centers in every single country is too expensive to survive. They are forced to choose between spending billions on global infrastructure or partnering with local providers who already have the right regulatory stamps. Microsoft chose the partnership model, launching a strategy called Microsoft Foundry to deploy regional AI models on Azure hardware that stays inside national borders. Microsoft Foundry is an elegant architectural solution because it lets Microsoft serve highly regulated markets without losing its grip on the underlying infrastructure. If a European company needs sovereign AI, Microsoft can partner with a French firm like Mistral to provide the models while running them on Azure servers located in Europe. The data never crosses the ocean, the processing stays local, and the regulators are happy. Microsoft keeps the infrastructure relationship, the customer stays in the ecosystem, and the system remains unified. This approach is efficient because Microsoft doesn't need to hire thousands of AI researchers in every single country or maintain dozens of separate global research wings. They let the regional partners handle the local models and regulatory nuances while Microsoft provides the heavy-duty cloud power. It is a partnership that satisfies national pride and legal requirements while maintaining Microsoft's massive infrastructure lead. While Google and OpenAI are trying to figure out their own sovereign plays, Microsoft's advantage is already baked into the architecture of Azure. Azure has more regional deployments and more compliance certifications than any other cloud provider on the planet. They have years of experience navigating the messy world of regulated markets, and building a rival footprint would take a competitor years of constant investment. By the time a rival could match that global presence, Microsoft will have already locked down the most important regional partnerships. The geopolitical moat is purely architectural, allowing Microsoft to handle sovereign requirements without ever losing control of the data flow. When a German bank uses a local AI model through Microsoft Foundry, the hardware and the data stay in Germany, but the relationship stays with Microsoft. The bank gets the compliance they need, and Microsoft keeps the customer on their platform. This is exactly why Microsoft is winning the race in regulated industries across the globe. They are the only ones offering compliance, sovereignty, and deep integration in one single package. Whether it's a healthcare provider in Germany or a government agency in India, they can all find a home on Azure that meets their local laws. The sovereign requirements are met, the infrastructure advantage is held, and the customer relationship is preserved. This geopolitical edge is structural, and it only gets stronger as more countries start demanding their own AI sovereignty. Every new law passed in Europe or Asia creates more demand for the exact infrastructure Microsoft has spent decades building. Each new partnership with a local model provider makes the ecosystem more resilient and harder to replace. Microsoft can keep pouring money into global Azure expansion because the world is moving toward the exact capabilities they are best at providing. They offer the sovereign infrastructure, the enterprise integration, and the regulatory peace of mind that no one else can match. It is a single platform for a fragmented world. Competitors will find this advantage nearly impossible to replicate in the short term. You cannot buy decades of operational experience or instant regulatory approval, and you certainly can't build global data centers overnight. Microsoft has already done the hard work and spent the necessary time. The advantage is structural, the moat is widening, and the system is working exactly as intended. The Capex to revenue translation. Infrastructure spending is a vanity metric unless it translates into actual revenue. This translation mechanism is the most critical piece of the puzzle to understand because it separates Microsoft's calculated moves from the speculative capital dumping we see across the rest of the industry. When you look at Microsoft's projected $80 billion Capex for 2025, you shouldn't view it as a traditional expense. In architectural terms, it is a revenue-generating asset. Every GPU they buy is a piece of infrastructure destined to run inference workloads, and every data center they build is a facility that will host customer applications for years. These networking investments aren't disappearing into R&D black holes. They are being deployed into systems that generate measurable contractual cash flow. We can already see this translation happening in Azure's financial performance. Azure revenue grew 40% year over year, which contributed $49.1 billion to the cloud segment in the most recent report. This isn't speculative growth based on hype, but realized revenue from enterprise customers who are paying for infrastructure services right now. The trajectory shows that every dollar of Capex is moving directly into customer demand and revenue generation. Microsoft is projecting $25 billion in AI revenue by the end of fiscal 2026, and that growth is coming from Copilot subscriptions and Azure AI services. This number isn't an aspirational goal or a marketing maybe. It is based on contracted revenue from existing customers and massive commitments from OpenAI. The OpenAI partnership alone ensures that a huge portion of this Capex will be consumed through legal service commitments, meaning the revenue pipeline is already locked in. Of course, the translation from Capex to revenue is never linear. Infrastructure investments usually take 12 to 24 months to start paying off. A GPU purchased this morning won't earn a cent until it is racked, configured, and finally consumed by a customer workload. This lag between spending the money and realizing the profit creates a timing gap that many investors struggle to wrap their heads around. But this timing gap is exactly where Microsoft's strategy reveals its true confidence. They are accelerating their spending despite that 2-year lag because they know the revenue is coming. They aren't guessing whether customers will want this infrastructure. They already have the contracts from OpenAI and enterprise customers who are currently deploying Azure OpenAI service. The demand is a known quantity, which makes the timing predictable. OpenAI's $250 billion Azure consumption commitment is the ultimate hedge, ensuring that Capex translates into revenue through strict contractual obligations. This isn't a pinky promise or a vague marketing slide. It is a legal contract where OpenAI must purchase $250 billion in services over the life of the agreement. Every GPU cluster Microsoft builds can be immediately pointed at OpenAI's requirements, turning infrastructure into guaranteed money. Competitors are spending similar amounts, but they lack these kinds of ironclad revenue guarantees. Google is dropping $75 billion on Capex, yet they don't have a single customer legally obligated to hand them $250 billion in return. Meta is spending upwards of $65 billion without any partner consumption guarantees, and Amazon's $100 billion spend is spread thin across a dozen different business units. None of them have the same level of certainty that Microsoft has baked into its build-out. This explains why Microsoft is so comfortable accelerating its spending while others are being questioned. The revenue pipeline is already committed, and the spending is backed by obligations that ensure the hardware will be used. They aren't betting on whether the world wants AI infrastructure. They already have the signed contracts that prove it. This translation is why Microsoft can outspend the competition without taking on the same level of financial risk. Their return on investment is effectively guaranteed by the architecture of their deals. When Microsoft spends $80 billion, they aren't speculating on the future, they are fulfilling the present. The risk is lower because the certainty of the check in the mail is so much higher. This is the architectural insight that separates Microsoft from the rest of the pack. Other companies are building data centers and hoping the users show up eventually. Microsoft is building because they have a legal certainty that the users are already there. That distinction is measured in billions of dollars of risk and years of runway before the math even starts to get fuzzy. The Capex to revenue translation is structural and contractually enforced. It is the reason Microsoft's dominance in the infrastructure layer isn't a temporary fluke. They can confidently push their spending into 2026 and beyond because the revenue is already spoken for. The infrastructure is obligated, the money is committed, and the certainty is built into the very foundation of the strategy. Competitor friction and strategic misalignment. Microsoft's strategy is a single integrated machine, while its competitors are currently fighting their own internal structures. These companies face massive friction that prevents them from executing at the same level. Google is currently trapped between two strategic positions that simply do not work together. On one hand, they have to protect search revenue, which is the cash cow that pays for everything else they do. On the other hand, they have to build cloud AI to keep up with Microsoft. These two goals are in a state of constant direct conflict. If Google makes Gemini too good at answering search queries, they create an existential threat to their own bank account. When Gemini gives a perfect answer, users stop clicking links, they stop seeing ads, and the revenue that funds Google's existence starts to dry up. They are incentivized to handicap their own AI to save their ad business, but doing that means losing to competitors who don't have a legacy model to protect. It is the innovator's dilemma in its most painful form. Technically, Google's AI is impressive in ways Microsoft's isn't. Gemini's 2 million token context window makes GPT-4o look small, and their TPU infrastructure is built specifically for these workloads. They have the research teams and the datasets to win on paper, but technical superiority doesn't lead to market dominance when your distribution channel is being choked by your own business model. Then you have Anthropic and OpenAI, who are fighting purely on model performance. Claude is great at reasoning, and GPT-4o is a multimodal powerhouse. These models win benchmarks, and they definitely win the headlines. However, they lack the infrastructure and the enterprise distribution that Microsoft owns. When a bank looks for an AI platform, they don't care about a benchmark. They care about compliance, integration, and the total cost of ownership. The startups win on the first point, but they fail on the rest. Salesforce is trying to compete at the CRM layer with Einstein, using AI to automate sales tasks and find insights. But Salesforce has a massive blind spot. They don't control the identity layer. When a user wants to share an Einstein insight with their team, that data has to leave Salesforce, get reformatted for Teams, and then move through Microsoft's pipes. That workflow friction is a killer, and it means Salesforce can win a single battle while losing the entire architectural war. The reality here is structural, and it isn't going away. No other competitor controls the full stack from identity all the way through to operations. Google has search, but they don't have your enterprise identity. Anthropic has the research, but they don't have the data centers. Salesforce has the CRM, but they don't have the productivity suite. Everyone else owns a piece of the puzzle, but Microsoft owns the table the puzzle is sitting on. This misalignment means competitors will continue to win small individual victories. Google might build a better model this month, and Anthropic might have better reasoning next month. Those wins are real, but they don't scale into market dominance because they don't solve the full enterprise problem. To win the enterprise, you have to control identity, data, infrastructure, and workflow. Only Microsoft has all four. The friction these competitors are feeling is going to compound over time. Google's internal conflict gets worse the better Gemini becomes, forcing them to choose between their past and their future. The AI startups face the friction of trying to grow without owning their own hardware. Salesforce is stuck building inside an ecosystem they will never control. Microsoft doesn't have these problems. Every move they make reinforces every other move they've already made. Investing in Azure makes Copilot better, and Copilot drives more people into Azure. Fabric consolidates the data, which feeds the AI, which drives the adoption of the entire stack. The strategy is coherent, the execution is aligned, and the advantage is built into the architecture. This is why Microsoft's lead is going to last, even if someone else builds a smarter model. The company that controls the full stack is the one that wins the war. When you control the identity, the data, the infrastructure, and the workflow, you aren't just a player in the market, you are the market. Competitors can win the occasional battle, but Microsoft wins the war because they own the battlefield. The adoption timeline and enterprise economics. Understanding why Microsoft maintains such a suffocating grip on the market requires you to look at enterprise adoption timelines rather than consumer metrics. Most observers fail to make this distinction, and that is why their market narratives rarely align with observable reality. Consumer AI follows a sprint. We measure new users in millions per quarter because the friction to join is almost zero. ChatGPT hit 100 million users in 2 months, Gemini leveraged Android distribution to reach hundreds of millions, and Claude scaled through simple web adoption. In this world, velocity is measured in weeks, and growth feels explosive because it is visible. Enterprise AI follows a fundamentally different, much slower curve. Here we measure progress in pilots rather than individual users. A pilot is a bounded deployment designed to test a specific architectural assumption or use case. You might see a hospital pilot, Azure OpenAI service within a single radiology department, or a manufacturer test Power Platform automation inside supply chain planning. These pilots usually involve 50 to 200 people and run for several months to evaluate if the deployment actually generates value. If the pilot succeeds, the organization expands to the next department, but if it fails, they adjust the configuration and try again. This mismatch in timing creates a massive optical illusion regarding market dominance. Consumer AI looks like it is winning because its growth is loud and fast, while enterprise AI looks like it is losing because its progress is quiet and incremental. The economic reality is exactly the opposite. While consumer AI revenue is measured in billions, the enterprise market is 10 times larger and generates tens of billions in revenue. It simply receives a fraction of the media attention. This visibility gap is structural. Consumer adoption happens in public, where users post their experiences on social media for everyone to see. Enterprise adoption happens behind closed doors, where pilots are conducted in private and deployments are buried in earnings calls rather than headlines. Market observers measure what they can see and wrongly assume that visibility equals dominance. They are tracking the wrong metric. Microsoft has optimized its entire strategy for this invisible curve. They aren't interested in winning consumer headlines. They are busy consolidating the enterprise control plane. They are winning where the capital lives, not where the attention is. This is why pundits constantly predict Microsoft's downfall. They look at consumer sentiment and assume it dictates enterprise reality. They are wrong. The enterprise timeline also creates a significant lag between infrastructure spending and actual revenue. Microsoft poured billions into Azure hardware throughout 2023 and 2024, but the payoff from those investments won't fully hit the books until 2026. If you only look at current capital expenditures, you see massive spending without immediate growth. But if you look at the long-term cycle, you see a calculated move that is already working. The timing is just invisible to those using a consumer stopwatch. The economics here are also driven by different forces. Consumer adoption relies on user preference and network effects, where someone chooses ChatGPT because they like the interface and recommend it to friends. Enterprise adoption is driven by organizational mandate and integration depth. A company deploys Copilot because it plugs into their existing authorization engine, regardless of whether individual employees prefer a different tool. This explains why Copilot looks weak in user surveys but remains dominant in deployment metrics. Workers might prefer a different LLM when they have a choice, but organizations choose Copilot because it is the designated secure tool for the job. These two facts coexist because they describe different markets. Consumer preference does not predict enterprise behavior. Organizational mandate does. Microsoft can project massive revenue growth despite low current seat penetration because they aren't betting on fickle user tastes. They are betting on expansion timelines that are already visible in their pilot data. Organizations that finished their initial tests are now rolling out to their entire workforce. This expansion is predictable and the revenue is forecastable. The strategy is not a guess, it is a reflection of observed organizational behavior. Microsoft's dominance is structural. It isn't built on benchmark wins or viral tweets. It is built on enterprise economics and expansion patterns that most people simply aren't looking at. They are winning the only market that actually drives long-term dominance and the governance hardening phase. Enterprise adoption is currently accelerating, but we are about to enter the governance hardening phase. This is the point where Microsoft's position shifts from being a choice to being an architectural necessity. Early AI deployments are almost always experimental. Organizations run small pilots to test use cases and measure productivity gains while keeping the risk contained. Because a 50-person pilot doesn't threaten the entire business, the governance requirements are usually minimal. You don't need a global compliance framework or complex cost allocation models when the scope is this small. These early tests operate with lightweight oversight because the potential for conditional chaos is manageable. The next phase changes everything. As organizations move from small pilots to mainstream adoption, governance becomes a mandatory requirement for survival. Mainstream adoption means thousands of employees are using Copilot and Power Platform apps are running critical business processes. When Azure OpenAI starts processing sensitive customer data at scale, the risk is no longer contained. At this point, governance is existential. True governance requires total visibility into how AI is being used. You need to know exactly who is using the tools, what data they are touching, and whether the outputs are compliant with your internal policies. This level of insight doesn't just happen by accident, it has to be built into the fabric of the platform itself. You also have to deal with cost allocation. The price of a 50-user pilot is a rounding error, but when you scale to 10,000 users, that cost becomes a material line item on the balance sheet. Organizations have to attribute those costs to specific business units to see who is actually generating value. This requires tracking systems that connect AI consumption directly to business outcomes, something most platforms aren't designed to do. Then there is the compliance framework. Organizations must ensure their AI isn't making biased decisions or leaking protected customer information. They need audit trails that can be explained to a regulator, which is a non-negotiable requirement in any serious industry. These aren't nice-to-have features. They are the gatekeepers for enterprise-wide deployment. Microsoft has already baked these governance tools into the core of their stack. Copilot analytics provide usage patterns, while Azure AI handles the heavy lifting of cost tracking and compliance auditing. These aren't afterthoughts or third-party add-ons. They are foundational capabilities built into the platform from day one. Most competitors simply lack this level of integrated oversight. Google is trying to build governance for Gemini, but it often feels like a separate layer rather than a core feature. Anthropic has great models, but Claude isn't natively tied into enterprise identity systems. Salesforce has Einstein, but that governance is trapped inside the CRM silo. None of them have treated governance as a platform-level requirement the way Microsoft has. This hardening phase will inevitably lead to enterprise consolidation. Organizations are going to standardize on the platform that offers the path of least resistance for compliance. The cost of trying to stitch together governance on a fragmented multi-vendor platform is simply too high. Once you build your security and audit workflows on Microsoft's stack, switching to a competitor means rebuilding your entire governance model from scratch. Microsoft is pouring money into observability and compliance because they know this phase is coming. They are building the infrastructure that makes their platform the only logical choice for a risk-averse CISO. By solving the governance problem, they are creating a level of structural lock-in that makes their competitors look like toys. This shift isn't a theoretical future event. It is happening right now. The companies that started pilots in 2024 are hitting the governance wall today. They are realizing that scale requires deep platform integration, and they are consolidating on Microsoft because the tools are already there. The switching cost is already becoming prohibitive. This is the real engine of Microsoft's dominance. It isn't just about who has the best chatbot or the fastest model. It is about structural lock-in through governance frameworks that make leaving the ecosystem an impossible task. As governance becomes the baseline for enterprise AI, Microsoft's advantage will only continue to compound. The long-term lock-in mechanism. Every integration point we have walked through creates its own independent value, but over time, that cumulative integration builds a structural lock-in that persists regardless of market pressure. This is the uncomfortable truth about the Microsoft ecosystem. Lock-in does not happen through legal contracts or aggressive licensing restrictions. That distinction matters because the real trap is architectural. When your organization consolidates on the Microsoft stack, you aren't stuck because of a document you signed, but because leaving would require you to dismantle your entire operational nervous system. The architecture is a series of dependencies where identity flows through Entra ID, productivity lives in Microsoft 365, and data consolidates within Fabric. Automation then runs through the Power Platform while operations flow through Dynamics 365, all while intelligence is fed by Copilot and Azure OpenAI. Each layer depends on the one beneath it, and each layer reinforces the perceived value of the others. When an organization consolidates on this stack, the switching costs they face are not merely financial, but are instead deeply organizational and temporal. If a healthcare provider has already deployed Azure OpenAI and cleared the massive hurdle of HIPAA compliance, moving to a competitor would mean starting that entire certification process from scratch. That recertification effort takes months or even years to complete, and the organizational strain combined with the risk of failure makes the move almost unthinkable. Consider a financial services firm that has built thousands of Power Platform apps that pull data from Fabric and trigger Dynamics 365 workflows. Switching to a different provider would require rebuilding every single one of those applications, which represents a development effort measured in thousands of engineer hours and millions of dollars in delayed business initiatives. The timeline for such a project is measured in years, not months, making the transition a logistical nightmare that most leadership teams will simply refuse to authorize. If a manufacturer has spent years training thousands of citizen developers to build on the Power Platform, switching to a competitor effectively turns that entire workforce's knowledge into garbage. The accumulated intellectual capital regarding integration patterns and troubleshooting techniques becomes worthless overnight, and the resulting productivity loss would cost millions. Because the retraining timeline is so long and the loss of momentum is so severe, the organization finds itself anchored to the platform by its own internal expertise. This lock-in mechanism is not coercive, and Microsoft does not have to force organizations to stay because the cost of leaving simply exceeds the benefit of switching. A competitor might theoretically offer a superior CRM, but that slight functional advantage does not justify the cost of re-architecting compliance frameworks and retraining an entire global staff. The economic calculation is clear. Staying is always cheaper than leaving. Competitors often offer better products at individual layers, such as Salesforce having a more robust CRM or Snowflake providing better data warehouse performance. These are legitimate technical advantages, and in isolated head-to-head comparisons, the competitors often win on features alone. However, those isolated comparisons fail to predict how an organization actually behaves, because businesses do not evaluate products in a vacuum. They evaluate them based on how they fit into the existing architectural gravity of their current stack. The lock-in is structural, meaning it does not actually depend on any single Microsoft product remaining the best in its class. Even if a rival developed a CRM that was demonstrably better than Dynamics 365, a consolidated organization would still likely pass on it. The switching cost would outweigh the functional gain, so the organization stays with the good enough option because it is already wired into everything else they do. This explains why enterprise customers continue to double down on Microsoft despite the availability of better standalone alternatives. They aren't choosing Microsoft because every single tool is the best on the market, but because the integrated system generates more total value than a collection of disconnected best-of-breed apps. The depth of that integration creates a type of value that isolated products cannot replicate, making the decision to stay perfectly rational from a business perspective. This mechanism only compounds as time goes on, and the longer you operate on the stack, the deeper those roots grow. Every new app built on the Power Platform and every new workflow automated through Power Automate adds another layer of cement to the foundation. The more data you consolidate into Fabric, the more your daily operations depend on that specific architecture, and the lock-in deepens with every passing quarter. This is the ultimate architectural advantage for Microsoft. It isn't that their products are inherently superior, but that the integrated system creates switching costs that eventually make competitors irrelevant to the conversation. An organization locked into this stack cannot leave without accepting a level of organizational pain that most are unwilling to endure. The competitor could be 10 times better, but the organization will stay with Microsoft anyway because the structural bond is simply too strong to break. The invisible dominance and market misconception. To understand why Microsoft is winning while the rest of the world looks elsewhere, we have to recognize the massive gap between what is visible and what is actually dominant. Microsoft's lead is largely invisible because it operates at the infrastructure layer rather than the interface layer where consumers play. While products like ChatGPT or Gemini are designed to be seen and measured by public adoption metrics, Microsoft is busy embedding itself into the plumbing of the global economy. Consumer AI products are built for visibility, which is why we see headlines about ChatGPT user signups or Claude's latest web interface updates. These tools are meant to be interacted with directly, making their growth easy to track and easy for the media to obsess over. Because they are consumer-facing, they are designed to be flashy and observable, leading many to believe that the AI war is being fought entirely on the surface of the internet. Enterprise AI infrastructure is the exact opposite because it is designed to be reliable and integrated rather than visible. Azure OpenAI runs inside private corporate data centers, and Microsoft Fabric consolidates sensitive data behind firewalls where the public will never see it. When Copilot integrates into Microsoft 365 or Dynamics 365, it becomes part of a workflow that already exists, making the transition seamless and hidden from the outside world. Market observers frequently mistake this lack of visibility for a lack of dominance. They see the massive consumer adoption of ChatGPT and assume it signals market leadership, or they look at Gemini's integration into Android and assume Google has the upper hand. These observations might be accurate for the consumer world, but they are terrible predictors of who is actually winning the enterprise, where the real money is made. The economic reality of the situation completely contradicts the popular narrative, as enterprise AI revenue is currently growing 3 times faster than consumer AI revenue. Organizations are quietly spending billions on infrastructure and consolidating their entire operations onto integrated platforms. This growth is accelerating and the revenue is very real, but it remains invisible to anyone who is only measuring success by how many people are visiting a chatbot website. This visibility gap is exactly why analysts constantly predict that Microsoft is falling behind. They are measuring the wrong things, watching consumer adoption curves and assuming those trends will dictate how a Fortune 500 company makes its architectural decisions. They look at Copilot seat penetration or user preference surveys and assume a low number means failure, but they are wrong on every count because they don't understand the enterprise timeline. The way a large company adopts technology is a quiet process that happens behind closed doors. A bank might run a Copilot pilot for its sales team without ever making a public announcement, then slowly expand that to service and operations over the next 6 months. By the time they have deployed it to 5,000 employees, the public still knows nothing about it because the deployment only shows up in internal metrics rather than news headlines. Observers miss this expansion because they aren't looking inside the organization. They are looking at viral demos and benchmark comparisons. They are focused entirely on the visibility layer, which means they are missing the dominance layer where the revenue is generated and the lock-in is solidified. This is where the competitive advantage actually compounds, far away from the noise of social media and tech blogs. Microsoft's strategy is to deliberately obscure itself within the enterprise control plane. The company doesn't care about winning consumer headlines or releasing flashy demos that go viral on Twitter. Instead, they focus on the boring stuff like compliance, governance, and deep integration, which doesn't attract media attention but does create an unbreakable moat. This invisibility is a massive strategic advantage rather than a weakness. While competitors are fighting for clicks and consumer mindshare, Microsoft is quietly consolidating the infrastructure that runs the world's largest businesses. While analysts debate which AI model is smarter, Microsoft is deepening the connection between identity, data, and workflow, making the specific model almost irrelevant compared to the system it lives in. The market misconception will likely continue because observers will always prefer to measure what is easy to see. They will keep predicting Microsoft's downfall based on consumer preferences, and they will keep assuming that a better interface will disrupt enterprise infrastructure. They will be wrong because the enterprise market doesn't care about interface appeal. It cares about integration depth and the total cost of ownership. This misunderstanding is where Microsoft's lead becomes truly structural. The company is winning the only market that actually matters, while the rest of the world is distracted by the market that doesn't. The dominance is real, the invisibility is permanent, and by the time the market realizes what has happened, it will be far too late for any competitor to catch up. The structural inevitability of Microsoft's position. Microsoft's dominance in the market is not a product of luck or fortunate timing, but rather a result of structural inevitability. This architectural insight explains why their position remains secure regardless of what competitors try or what new technological breakthroughs emerge. To run enterprise AI effectively, you need three specific architectural layers. Identity determines who can access what, data determines what information is actually available, and infrastructure determines where the processing happens. Microsoft is the only player that controls all three layers through a single integrated ecosystem. They use Entra ID for identity, Microsoft 365 and Fabric for data, and Azure for the underlying infrastructure. Most competitors only control one or two of these layers, which leaves them fundamentally incomplete. Google has the infrastructure through Google Cloud, yet they do not control enterprise identity the way Entra does, nor do they consolidate data like Fabric. Salesforce owns the CRM data, but lacks the identity and infrastructure layers, while companies like Anthropic build the models without owning any of the three foundational layers. This creates a cycle of structural inevitability where consolidating on one Microsoft layer makes it irrational not to adopt the others. When an organization deploys Azure for its infrastructure, they quickly find that Entra ID is the only natural identity layer to use. If that same organization uses Microsoft 365, they soon realize that Fabric is the most logical place for their data to live. Once they deploy Copilot, they see that the entire stack creates a level of value that disconnected tools cannot match. The incentive structure here is purely economic because consolidation is the only way to reduce complexity and improve integration. By bringing everything under one roof, a company reduces its total cost of ownership and simplifies its entire operation. This is why enterprise cloud spending continues to concentrate on Microsoft, as consolidation is a predictable, economically rational choice rather than simple vendor lock-in. Because of this structural inevitability, Microsoft will likely stay on top even if a competitor builds a better product at a single layer. The company that controls the full stack wins every time, simply because a unified system creates a type of value that isolated point solutions can never replicate. The capital allocation imperative for executives. For executives and decision makers, the strategic reality of this shift is both clear and immediately actionable. The enterprise AI market is currently consolidating around integrated platforms instead of best-of-breed point solutions. This is not some temporary trend that will fade next year, but a permanent structural shift in how businesses generate value from AI. Organizations that choose to consolidate on the Microsoft stack early will gain competitive advantages that compound over time. The first major win is faster deployment, because when you have already standardized on Entra, Microsoft 365, and Fabric, adding Copilot doesn't require new infrastructure. You don't have to sit through new vendor negotiations or wait for fresh compliance certifications since the foundation is already there. This moves your deployment timeline from months down to weeks, which significantly compresses your time to value. Lower integration costs represent the second major advantage of this approach. When you build Power Platform apps that consume Fabric data, those applications automatically gain the benefits of Copilot integration without extra work. If Dynamics 365 is already your system of record, then Azure OpenAI insights flow directly into your existing operational workflows. This happens naturally because the architecture is unified, whereas companies chasing best-of-breed strategies end up spending millions of dollars and thousands of engineering hours just to get their tools to talk to each other. The third advantage is a much faster return on investment. When your integration costs are lower and your timelines are shorter, you start seeing the money come back into the business much sooner. An organization running a consolidated Microsoft stack can see real productivity gains within a few weeks of turning the system on. Meanwhile, a company with fragmented infrastructure stays stuck in the integration phase for months, falling behind while their consolidated competitors reinvest their AI gains into even more capability. The capital allocation decision you face is binary. You either consolidate on Microsoft or you manage a fragmented architecture. There is no middle ground here because the economics of the modern enterprise do not support best-of-breed strategies at scale. Integration complexity grows exponentially with every new point solution you add, which drives up the total cost of ownership and multiplies your governance burden. Organizations that try to stay fragmented will eventually hit a capital allocation crisis where they must either consolidate or accept a permanent decline in competitiveness. Consolidating on Microsoft requires you to invest heavily in 3 specific areas, starting with your data architecture. You need to move data from your various silos into Fabric, which is a massive undertaking involving migration, schema design, and new governance rules. However, this is the absolute prerequisite for enterprise AI, because without a consolidated data layer, your AI will only generate fragmented insights from fragmented data. Your second investment must be in automation capability. This means building Power Platform applications to handle business processes, which requires training your staff and setting up a real governance framework for app development. While this takes effort, the return is immediate because automation removes manual labor and lets your knowledge workers focus on high-value tasks. It also improves your process consistency and makes compliance much easier to manage. The third necessary investment is a robust governance framework. You have to implement controls, compliance checks, and cost management systems specifically for enterprise AI. This involves building observability into your Copilot rollout and making sure you have audit trails for every AI-driven decision. Doing this early prevents a governance crisis later, saving you from the desperate scramble to fix compliance risks after the system is already live. The strategic imperative is to audit your enterprise architecture right now. You need to identify where you are already consolidating and where you are still clinging to fragmented systems. Prioritize consolidation in the areas where AI is already being planned and follow a strict sequence. Data first, automation second, and governance third. This order matters because data consolidation is what makes automation possible, and automation creates the logs that your governance systems need to track. You must treat Copilot as infrastructure, not as a novelty or a simple productivity tool. Most organizations make the mistake of thinking Copilot is an optional feature that employees can choose to use if they feel like it. In reality, Copilot is foundational infrastructure that enables organizational capability, much like email or basic collaboration tools. It is a system-wide capability that you deploy to improve operational efficiency across the entire company. Architect your system for integration rather than just feature adoption. Many leaders evaluate Copilot by asking if it summarizes meetings well or if it can draft a decent email, but those are the wrong questions. The only metric that matters is integration depth, specifically how well it connects to your data architecture and your existing automation workflows. The features are secondary to how deeply the AI is woven into your operational systems. If you are still running separate email systems or document platforms, you need to consolidate on Microsoft 365 immediately. The productivity gains from having a single environment far outweigh the temporary pain of migration. The same logic applies to your cloud infrastructure. If you are managing multiple providers, moving to Azure simplifies your governance and strengthens your integration with Copilot. Finally, you must consolidate your data architecture by moving away from disconnected data lakes and warehouses into Fabric. While specialized point solutions might claim better performance in a vacuum, they cannot compete with the integration Fabric offers to the Power Platform and Copilot. The cost of moving to a unified system is measured in months, but the cost of staying fragmented is measured in years of rising complexity and falling behind the market. This capital allocation decision is not optional for any serious enterprise. Organizations that refuse to consolidate will face overwhelming pressure from competitors who have already streamlined their stacks. The window for this transition is roughly 18 to 36 months, meaning those who start now will be finished by 2027. If you delay, you will be stuck playing catch-up while your competitors are already reaping the rewards of a unified AI strategy. The investment required is substantial, but the returns are easy to measure. Companies that fully commit to the Microsoft stack are reporting productivity jumps of 15 to 25%, along with faster time to market and better customer response times. These returns justify the initial spend, and the payback period is usually measured in quarters rather than years. The path forward is to invest in data, automation, and governance while treating AI as the core infrastructure of your business. The 5-year outlook and market consolidation. The timeline for market consolidation is both measurable and predictable. Over the next 5 years, the enterprise AI market will undergo a structural transformation that will determine the competitive winners and losers for the decade that follows. This process begins with regulated industries like healthcare, finance, and government. These sectors face the most stringent compliance requirements, and they also have the most to lose from AI deployment failures, When a healthcare organization deploys an AI system that generates incorrect clinical recommendations, it faces immediate liability and regulatory scrutiny. Similarly, a financial institution that uses AI to make discriminatory lending decisions will face massive fines and reputational damage. If a government agency deploys a system that violates citizen privacy, the result is legal action and public backlash. The compliance risk is substantial and the governance requirements are non-negotiable. Regulated industries will naturally gravitate toward platforms that offer integrated compliance frameworks. Azure OpenAI service already provides HIPAA compliance, FedRAMP authorization, and SOC 2 Type 2 certification. These are not features that organizations can simply add later. They are the absolute prerequisites for deployment. Organizations in these sectors will standardize on Azure OpenAI because the compliance infrastructure is already built. Competitors will be forced to build equivalent frameworks, but that timeline is measured in years. By the time they have equivalent certifications, Microsoft will have already consolidated the regulated market. The consolidation timeline in these industries is roughly 12 to 24 months. During this period, organizations will move from small pilots to mainstream deployment. The speed of this shift will accelerate as governance best practices emerge and early adopters publish their case studies. Other organizations will follow these established patterns, and the consolidation will compound as more players adopt the technology and switching costs increase. This trend will eventually extend to other industries as governance frameworks mature. Retail organizations will consolidate on Microsoft's stack to gain inventory optimization and better customer experience capabilities. Manufacturing firms will do the same to gain supply chain visibility and predictive maintenance. Technology companies will consolidate to improve developer productivity and code quality. The timeline extends beyond regulated industries as the benefits of integration become clear across every sector. Market share in enterprise AI will correlate with platform integration depth rather than raw model performance. This is the critical insight that separates enterprise market dynamics from consumer ones. A consumer chooses between ChatGPT and Claude based on which model generates a better response, but an enterprise chooses based on which platform generates better organizational outcomes. Those outcomes depend on integration depth, which requires control across identity, data, infrastructure, and workflow. Only Microsoft controls all four layers. Microsoft's market share in enterprise AI will likely increase from current levels to total dominance by 2029. Current estimates place them at 35 to 40% of the market, but that number will likely exceed 50% within 5 years. This shift will be driven by economic rationality. Organizations that consolidate on Microsoft's stack will realize productivity gains that far exceed what is available from best-of-breed strategies. This economic advantage will drive the consolidation, and it will accelerate as adoption grows and switching costs become prohibitive. This consolidation will not be driven by vendor lock-in or forced adoption. Organizations will choose this path because the integrated platform generates more value than the sum of separate alternatives. The value comes from the depth of the integration, not from contractual restrictions or licensing terms. When an organization consolidates on Microsoft, they do so because it is the most economically rational move for their business. The 5-year timeline means the competitive dynamics of the enterprise AI market are already determined. The outcome is not in doubt. The only real question is the speed of the transition. Organizations that move early will gain a competitive advantage, while those that wait will be forced to play catch-up. Organizations that refuse to consolidate will face declining competitiveness as their rivals realize massive AI-driven productivity gains. This is why Microsoft can confidently invest so heavily in capital spending and infrastructure expansion. The company is not betting on uncertain outcomes, but is instead responding to consolidation dynamics that are already observable in pilot data. The consolidation is happening now, and the revenue will follow. The dominance is structural. The 5-year outlook is clear. The enterprise AI market will consolidate around integrated platforms, and Microsoft will dominate because they control the full stack. Competitors will capture niche markets where they offer superior point solutions, but the overall market will settle on Microsoft. The timeline is 18 to 36 months for most organizations, and by 2029, the process will be largely complete. The competitive moat will be deep, the switching costs will be prohibitive, and Microsoft's dominance will be both structural and persistent. The architectural decisions that matter. The consolidation we are seeing is not an accident of history. It is the inevitable result of specific architectural decisions that Microsoft made years ago. These choices created the conditions for their current dominance, and understanding them reveals why competitors cannot easily replicate Microsoft's position. The first major decision was to unify identity across every product. Azure Active Directory is not just a standalone authentication system. It is the foundational layer that connects the entire ecosystem. When you authenticate to Microsoft 365, you are using Azure AD, and the same is true when you access Azure infrastructure or the Power Platform. Even Dynamics 365 relies on this same identity layer. Because identity is unified, there is a single source of truth for who can access what across the entire enterprise. This unified architecture creates a compounding advantage for the platform. Every new product Microsoft adds to the stack automatically inherits this identity layer. When Copilot was released, it integrated with Azure AD immediately, meaning organizations did not need to set up separate authentication. The integration was automatic, which is why Copilot deployment is so much faster for organizations already using Microsoft 365. The infrastructure was already in place before the product even existed. Competitors simply lack this unified identity architecture. Google Cloud has its own identity system, but it does not integrate seamlessly with Google Workspace. Salesforce has identity capabilities, but they are isolated within the CRM system, and Anthropic has no identity system at all. Each competitor built their systems independently, so the integration between them is manual and incomplete. Organizations trying to use multiple vendors must build custom identity bridges, and the complexity grows with every new tool they add. The second decision was to consolidate data gravity. Microsoft designed Fabric to be the central repository for all enterprise information. Data from Microsoft 365, Dynamics 365, and Azure applications all flows into Fabric, and external data can be integrated just as easily. Once that data is in Fabric, it becomes available to every downstream system. Power Platform apps can consume it, Copilot can access it, and Azure ML can use it for training. The data is unified and its value compounds over time. This data consolidation creates a moat that persists regardless of what competitors do. An organization that has moved its data into Fabric has already solved its core architectural problems. Switching to a competitor would mean re-architecting the entire data consolidation process from scratch. The switching cost is prohibitive, so the organization stays with Fabric because the alternative is starting over. Competitors might offer superior performance in specific areas. Snowflake has better query performance, BigQuery has better machine learning integration, and Databricks is better for data science. These are legitimate technical advantages, but they do not solve the data consolidation problem. An organization that has already consolidated its data into Fabric will not switch to Snowflake just for a performance boost. The work is already done, and the cost of moving exceeds the benefit of the switch. The third decision was to embed automation directly into the productivity layer. Power Platform is not a separate system that organizations have to adopt on its own. It is built directly into Microsoft 365. Users can build Power Apps without leaving their familiar ecosystem, and they can create Power Automate workflows from within Teams or Outlook. They can even build dashboards in Power BI alongside their Excel spreadsheets. The automation capability is embedded in the tools people already use every day. This creates a distribution advantage that competitors cannot match. Salesforce and Mendix might offer superior low-code development platforms, but they require separate adoption. Organizations have to train users on new systems, establish new governance frameworks, and manage separate deployments. The friction is substantial. Power Platform faces no such hurdles because the capability is already sitting in the tools the users know. The fourth decision was to treat Copilot as a platform capability rather than a standalone product. Copilot is not a separate system that organizations have to evaluate and purchase independently. It is integrated into Microsoft 365, Azure, Power Platform, and Dynamics 365. Copilot in Teams summarizes your meetings, while Copilot in Excel analyzes your data. The same underlying AI capability is distributed across every product automatically. The value is immediate because the distribution is built in. This platform approach creates a massive compounding advantage. Every time Microsoft adds a new product, Copilot integration is there from day one. Organizations do not have to decide whether to adopt AI for each specific tool because the integration is already finished. Competitors offering point solutions cannot match this. Their AI capabilities are isolated within single products, which constrains their value and creates high adoption friction. The fifth decision was to design for integration instead of isolation. Every Microsoft product is built to work with every other Microsoft product. Data flows freely, authentication is unified, and workflows can span multiple tools under a centralized governance model. This means the value of the stack compounds as you add more pieces. Adding Fabric to an organization that already uses Microsoft 365 creates value through the integration between the two. Adding Power Platform or Dynamics 365 only increases that integrated value. Competitors that built their systems independently cannot match this depth. Salesforce built its CRM in a vacuum and is now trying to bolt on integrations, but they are not foundational. Google built cloud independently from Workspace, and the integration remains incomplete. Anthropic built models with no connection to enterprise systems at all. Their integration is shallow, which limits the value they can provide. These architectural decisions were made years ago, long before the current AI boom. They were based on a specific vision of how enterprise software should work, and that vision has been proven correct. These choices created the conditions for dominance, and competitors cannot replicate them without rebuilding their entire product portfolios. The advantage is structural, it is persistent, and it is why Microsoft's position in the market will endure. The competitive response and market dynamics. Microsoft is consolidating the enterprise market, and its competitors are fully aware they are being boxed out. These companies are not sitting still, but their counter moves are being strangled by architectural decisions they made a decade ago. When you look closely at their strategies, it becomes clear why these responses will fail to stop the momentum of the Microsoft stack. Google is attempting to fight back by accelerating Gemini development and positioning Google Cloud AI as the only real alternative to Azure OpenAI. They have poured billions into research to ensure Gemini 3.1 Pro can handle complex reasoning with a context window that dwarfs the competition. If this were a pure laboratory contest, Google might be winning, but technical superiority is a weak weapon when your distribution channel is broken. Google's reach is limited by a legacy business model that they are desperate to protect, which prevents them from embedding AI as deeply as Microsoft has. To compensate for this, Google is trying to undercut Microsoft on price by offering Workspace AI for $20 to $30 per user. While a $10 monthly saving looks good on a spreadsheet, price only matters if the products are actually comparable. Microsoft 365 Copilot is woven into Fabric, the Power Platform, and Dynamics 365, while Google's AI remains largely trapped inside the Workspace bubble. Most organizations will not abandon their entire data architecture just to save a few dollars, especially when the cost of retraining developers and rebuilding compliance frameworks would run into the millions. Google is also chasing the sovereign AI trend by partnering with regional model providers to meet strict data residency laws. This is a logical move, but Microsoft is already neutralizing it through the Microsoft Foundry program. By partnering with Mistral and Cohere and hosting them on Azure infrastructure, Microsoft offers the exact same residency benefits, but with much better integration. Google isn't creating a unique advantage here. They are simply trying to match a baseline that Microsoft has already established. Anthropic has taken a different path by positioning Claude as the thinking person's model with transparent, well-structured reasoning. They are betting entirely on model quality, but in a corporate environment where Copilot is the mandated tool, how well a model reasons is often irrelevant. Users aren't choosing their tools based on a blind taste test of logic. They are using what the IT department has already integrated into their workflow. Anthropic's superior outputs cannot overcome the massive distribution advantage that Microsoft has baked into the enterprise stack. To solve this, Anthropic is trying to build its own distribution through partnerships with major consulting firms and systems integrators. This is a legitimate way to get into the door, but it is an agonizingly slow process that takes years to yield results. Microsoft's distribution is automatic because it is part of the product itself, meaning it reaches the entire market instantly. By the time Anthropic's partnerships mature, Microsoft will have already finished consolidating the mainstream enterprise market. Salesforce is also in the fight, deepening Einstein's integration to claim the title of the AI-first CRM. They are adding intelligence to every layer of sales and marketing, but they are still haunted by the decision to build CRM as an isolated island. Salesforce does not control the underlying identity, the data gravity, or the infrastructure, which means Einstein is effectively building AI in a vacuum. This isolation creates a ceiling on the value they can provide compared to a unified stack. They are trying to bridge this gap by building connectors to data warehouses and opening up new APIs to become a broader platform. However, this transformation is running years behind the curve, as Microsoft unified identity back in 2010 and consolidated data gravity in 2023. Salesforce is still trying to build basic data connectors in 2026, and that massive timeline gap means they won't catch up to an integrated stack for the foreseeable future. Amazon's response has been to push AWS Bedrock as a neutral, model-agnostic platform where customers can pick and choose their preferred AI. This plays to Amazon's traditional strength in infrastructure, but it ignores the reality of enterprise integration. An organization that has already standardized on Azure isn't going to migrate to AWS just for model neutrality when the switching costs are so high. Most companies will choose the integration advantage of Azure over the theoretical freedom of choice offered by AWS. Finally, Meta is flooding the market with Llama, positioning open-source weights as the democratic alternative to proprietary black box models. This is a massive contribution to the community, but it doesn't solve the problems of a modern enterprise. Running Llama requires an organization to solve data consolidation, governance, and infrastructure management entirely on their own. When you add up those hidden costs, the total cost of ownership usually exceeds the price of using an integrated service like Azure OpenAI. These competitive responses represent billions of dollars in investment and genuine engineering effort. However, they are all trying to win by playing to individual strengths that don't address the full architectural problem. Google cannot easily unify identity, and Amazon cannot easily build deep enterprise workflows. Only Microsoft is addressing the entire stack at once, which is why they are winning the war while others are just winning individual battles. The 5-year outlook and market consolidation. The timeline for this consolidation is not a mystery. It is a predictable structural shift that will define the next decade of enterprise computing. Over the next 5 years, we will see a total transformation of how companies buy and deploy software. This shift is starting right now in regulated industries like healthcare, finance, and government. These sectors have the most to lose from an AI hallucination or a data leak, and they cannot afford to move fast and break things. A hospital that deploys a flawed clinical AI faces massive liability, just as a bank using a biased lending model faces ruinous regulatory fines. For these organizations, governance is not a nice-to-have feature. It is the primary requirement for even starting a pilot. Because of this, regulated industries are consolidating on Azure because the compliance infrastructure is already there. Azure OpenAI comes with HIPAA, FedRAMP, and SOC 2 certifications out of the box, which are prerequisites that take competitors years to earn. By the time other platforms can check all those boxes, Microsoft will have already locked down the most profitable segments of the regulated market. We expect the consolidation of these high-stakes industries to be complete within the next 12 to 24 months. As early adopters move from small pilots to full-scale production, they will create the blueprints that everyone else follows. This creates a compounding effect where the more organizations adopt the stack, the more the industry standardizes around it, making the cost of switching even higher for those who wait. Once the regulated industries lead the way, the rest of the market will follow as governance frameworks become standardized. Retailers will move to the Microsoft stack to optimize their supply chains, and manufacturers will adopt it for predictive maintenance and shop floor automation. The benefits of having a unified identity and data layer are simply too large for any industry to ignore for long. The most important thing to understand is that market share in this era will be driven by integration depth, not by who has the smartest model. A consumer might switch from ChatGPT to Claude because the prose sounds better, but a corporation chooses a platform based on organizational outcomes. Those outcomes are a direct result of how well the AI talks to the data, the identity system, and the existing workflows. Since Microsoft is the only player controlling all 4 layers, they are the only ones who can deliver those outcomes at scale. By 2029, Microsoft's share of the enterprise AI market will likely jump from its current 40% to well over 50%. This isn't happening because of aggressive sales tactics or vendor lock-in in the traditional sense. It is happening because of economic rationality, as companies realize that an integrated platform produces more value than a collection of best-of-breed tools that don't talk to each other. Organizations are choosing to consolidate because the integrated model is simply more efficient. The value isn't coming from a restrictive contract or a licensing trick. It's coming from the fact that the system actually works as a single unit. It is much easier to secure and manage one unified environment than it is to stitch together 5 different AI vendors and hope the security policies remain consistent. This predictable shift is exactly why Microsoft is comfortable spending record amounts on capital expenditures and data center expansion. They aren't gambling on a maybe. They are building for a consolidation that is already visible in their early deployment data. The infrastructure is being built today because the structural dominance of the platform is already a mathematical certainty. The 5-year outlook is a world where the enterprise AI market has settled around a few integrated giants with Microsoft at the center. Competitors will still exist, but they will be relegated to niche roles or specific point solutions that plug into the larger ecosystem. For most organizations, the window to choose a foundation is closing fast, and by 2028, the architectural moats will be too deep to cross. Microsoft's dominance will no longer be a trend. It will be a permanent part of the enterprise landscape. The silent coup. Microsoft is not winning the AI war because they have better models or flashier consumer products, but because they have achieved total architectural dominance. They own the identity layer and the data, while simultaneously controlling the infrastructure and the daily workflow of the modern enterprise. While competitors fight for headlines, Microsoft is quietly consolidating the entire enterprise control plane. This victory is structural rather than tactical, and in many ways the outcome is already determined. You must consolidate your data architecture and standardize on integrated governance immediately. Treat Copilot as foundational infrastructure instead of a novelty, because the organizations that execute this specific strategy will be the only ones left standing in the AI economy. Subscribe for the next deep dive and connect with me on LinkedIn. Help me find the stories hidden behind the numbers.